Hey folks, this is Jakob Sanderson of Thinking About Thinking and co-host of Dynasty Points on the FantasyPoints YouTube and podcast network. And here is another Dynasty 101 video on taking inventory of your Dynasty teams. Do you remember the first couple weeks at school when you were young and you'd have picked out all your pencils, your binders, your duotangs, your textbooks, and you're gonna say, this is the year I stay organized, this is the year I'm on track. All of a sudden, maybe you miss a couple classes, maybe you don't take that good of notes one day, maybe you've doodled too much on the front of your binder, it doesn't look as nice as it used to, and all of a sudden you start to feel like things are a little bit in disarray. I know that happened to me. I don't want that to happen to you with your Dynasty teams. That's why today is going to be about keeping on track, taking inventory, making sure that your Dynasty teams are at the top of your leagues. But before we get into that, really quick, if you want to make sure that you have all the tools to succeed in your Dynasty leagues, that means you're going to want access to the FantasyPoints data suite. I know for my teams, and especially for my content, I would not be able to write my weekly column without access to the advanced rushing metrics on the FantasyPoints data suite. And there's a lot more than advanced rushing metrics. That includes, of course, the average separation score, also known as the AS score, and all of the other great stuff that they have at the FantasyPoints data suite. If you want access to that, make sure to use code JAKOB25, that's JAKOB25, for 25% off of the FantasyPoints data suite. Now let's get into today's video.
What? Why are you shaking your head? You're welcome.
In this video, we're going to cover how you evaluate where your Dynasty team stands and what that means for what you should do, and then what actions you should take and when to execute that plan. First step is what I call the power rating, okay? So I have a sheet where I have all of my teams on one Google Sheet, and I have all the picks that I have there, and then I have a power rating of each team and where it stands, and I have a tier rating for each of those teams. So step one is the power rating, and I calculate that quick and dirty way. I just go to the Keep Trade Cut power rankings, and I input my league, I see where it puts me, and I put in the number. Either it'll say, I'm third best team in my league, sixth best, 12th best, whatever. That's in terms of the buying power. If you want to be more precise, especially if you like my rankings, I do all my rankings in base first value. So if you wanted to, you could add up all of the base first valuations of all the assets on your team, all the players, all the picks. And if it comes out above 16, that's the median threshold for a team in a 12-person league. So above 16, above average buying power, below 16, below average buying power. Lots of ways to calculate that. Why that's important is it allows me to tier out where my team stands. So I have a bunch of different categories of teams. The absolute best is what I call my dynasties. Those are teams that have a lot of youth. They also have a lot of production. They have picks. These are teams that are going to contend this year and every year going forward as long as this league is alive. These are the cash cows of my dynasty portfolio. I use a very high bar. There's only a couple teams that I would really put in that tier. Next group is what I call the favorites. These are teams that are probably going to get a bye. These are a really elite teams this year. Maybe not quite as much long-term value as the dynasties, but really, really strong teams in the near term. Below that is my contenders. These are teams that are probably going to make the playoffs. I would say a 2/3 or higher chance to make the playoffs this year. But maybe not quite as elite as some of the favorite teams or the dynasty teams. The value of these teams could be kind of all over the board. I have pretty high value contenders, lower value contenders. Then I have my tank teams, which is the teams that are completely tanking, right? We're all in for the number one overall pick. I've sold off all my assets. And the transition tier before the tank teams is what I call the teardown teams. These are teams where I made the decision to tank. I just haven't fully executed it yet. There's still some players that I need to sell that are depreciating. And so how do I make these determinations, right? Part of it's the power rating, and part of it is the near-term projection of my team, what it looks like. You can see the projection of your team versus all the other teams each week in whatever app you're playing on. And why it's important to me is this. I'm trying to maximize the expected value of my dynasty portfolio over a sustained period of time. That means I want to spend as many years as possible with the highest expected value as possible. Or really, I want to be having a better than 8% chance, which is your average, of winning my league in as many years as I can. It's hard to do that if you're punting off a lot of years. And that's why I have 2 rules of thumb for Dynasty. Number 1, if you can have a top 3 buying power team, always compete. You should always be trying to compete if you can have a top 3 buying power team while being competitive. Number 2, if you have a bottom 3 buying power team, you should probably always be selling, right? You don't want to be putting yourself in a spot where you're trying to grind every nickel and dime out of a really low value contender, because your players are going to expire, and if you don't win the league that year, you might be facing now a 2-3 year rebuild. Whenever you have excess years that you're not competing, it's really, really hard to make that up because fantasy is pretty random. We don't walk into playoff games with an 80% chance to win. We usually walk in with something between a 40 to 60% chance to win. So you want to make sure that you're always going to have a chip at a chair. The number one way to increase your chance to win in any given year, of course, is having a bye. And that gets into the next step of this, which is trying to push more of the tiers of my teams towards the favorite tier and towards the tank tier and less in those middle tiers. So any team where I think I have a reasonable amount of value, where I can stay in the upper half of buying power and try to cash in to being a buy team, I want to be able to do that. I want to look at my contenders and I want to try and transition as many of them as I can towards favorites. I also, on the other hand, want to look at some of these contenders that maybe are a little lower value, and I want to potentially look at, should I be actually trying to contend with this team, or am I better off tanking, increasing my value, and then potentially having teams that can challenge for buys in future years? And that brings me to the last tier that I haven't mentioned yet, which is the TBD tier. These are all of the teams that I just don't really know what they are quite yet. And my goal over the first half of the season is to have as few TBD teams and contenders as possible. Every week I want to be going into my sheet and I want to have made decisions on what my teams are going to be. And I either want to be moving contenders to favorites, and I want to be moving TBDs either to contenders into favorites, or I want to be moving some of the lower value contenders and the TBDs into teardowns and eventually into tanks. And the hope is by mid-season, my portfolio starts to look like a lot of teams that are competing for buys, and then the remaining teams are competing for the first overall selection. That way, every team has some sort of objective. Every team has a chance to have a very legitimate chance of winning the league this year, or a pathway where I can get to that in short order. So let's just recap a little bit about all this. Step 1 is you want to figure out the power rating of your team. You want to figure out where you stand relative to your league in terms of the buying power of your assets. Step 2, you want to try and sort your teams into what you're planning to doing. Are you a favorite in your league? Are you potentially a contender in your league? Do you not really know what you're doing yet? Are you already tanking, right? And then that crucial step 3 is you want to go through your teams and make the moves that you want to make to try and push your teams out into these 2 different directions. Trying to push your better contenders into favorites, trying to push some of your weaker teams that are competing into the tank category so that every team has an objective they're chasing and you have fewer teams kind of languishing in the middle, losing value year over year without a great chance to win. Going through this process is going to keep you on track, it's going to keep you organized, and ultimately it's going to lead to a much higher value of your portfolio over time. Hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to check back soon for another Dynasty 101. Thank you.